War, Kuwait, Iraq, and what will become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia again. Now, according to the Conference of Uqair, Kuwait's northern border with Iraq was confirmed to be the same border that was basically established in 1913. So that was a benefit to Kuwait. On the other hand, Kuwait lost 2/3 of its southern territory to what will become the Kingdom of Iraq. Okay, Kuwait will get its independence from Great Britain in 1961. Immediately, Iraq will invade Kuwait. So Iraq is going to contest its southern border with Kuwait. And we can see why, this is not a great border. So this is the southern border. So here is Kuwait here. And Kuwait also has these two large islands, Bubiyan and Warba. Here is Iraq, Iraq's southern border. So Iraq has almost no coastline. So she has a naval base at Qasr, and her ships have to go out this narrow channel to get into the Persian Gulf. So, I mean, this coastline only represents about 35 miles. So Iraq is like, southern Iraq is like the apex of a triangle. So very little territory there. So Iraq wanted territorial modification. The British landed troops back in Kuwait. Then the Arab League took over. The Arab League confirmed Kuwait's border with Iraq. So there was no border change. And then a few years later, Iraq's government, a new government, confirmed Iraq's southern border with Kuwait. Oh, this is the last slide. Well, okay. So Kuwait has caused a lot of problems, really through no fault of her own. But after the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, 1988, a war fought for 8 years with no territorial gain at the end. Saddam Hussein had great debts. He owed about $81 billion to Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf nations, including Kuwait. So Saddam Hussein, he looked across the border, he could see Kuwait, this small country, but it's like a Cornish hen, a fat Cornish hen, oil rich. So Saddam Hussein thought that he would solve his economic problems by taking over Kuwait and making it the 19th province of Iraq. Okay, that led to a 28-member coalition to evict Saddam Hussein from Iraq. We might say that indirectly, the eviction of Saddam Hussein from Iraq will lead to the American invasion of Iraq 12 years later. It's an indirect relationship. Namely, Saddam Hussein was not observing a UN resolution that resulted from the Kuwait crisis, Resolution 687. He seemed to be hiding weapons away from the weapons inspectors, and that was used by the United States as an excuse to invade Iraq in 2003. Okay, that invasion shattered the country. It shattered the existing order. It may not have been a pleasant order, but it was an order. It offered the Kurds further opportunity to advance towards a hoped-for statehood. In addition, the invasion brought about the imposition of democracy, quote unquote. The imposition of democracy has favored, obviously, the Shiite majority. So overnight, the Shiites, who had not had much political power, the political power in Iraq had traditionally been held by the Sunnis, found itself as top dog. Okay, this invoked a Sunni insurgency. So we have the emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has morphed into ISIS. And so that has created the situation today. So ISIS has its capital in Raqqa, Syria. So it's involved in both Syria and in Iraq. So it has obliterated the border between Syria and Iraq. But the problem isn't the border between Syria and Iraq. The problem is ISIS. So in closing, I would say that the problem at heart is really an existential problem between competing visions of Islam. You have the Iranian vision, thanks to the revolution of 1979, and then you have the al-Qaeda vision. So you have the internationalization of a militant Sunni Islam colliding with Iranian Shiite Islam. They both collide in Syria and in Iraq. So now it's al-Qaeda in Iraq is ISIS, so ISIS and Iran are colliding. And we might also say that as fundamental as this problem is the question of the place of Islam in the political life of a Muslim nation. And this has been the reason for the failure of the Arab Spring in all countries that had an Arab Spring except for Tunisia. Thank you. Okay.
Does this thing work?
Yeah, that's for the video portion of it.
Okay.
So I don't know, hell or something. Look at this.
That's what tires are for.
Right. And you put this in your pocket.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
And you can
I can.
just X me out.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you once again for inviting me to come to Stetson. And since the last presentation focused...
I think you may have to use
Oh, okay. Yeah. Can you guys hear me without the mic? No, oh dear, that's bad. I thought I had a loud voice. Okay, so since the last presentation focused on the historical development of borders in the Middle East, which I was also going through part of, it actually is really a great complementary sort of a double presentation, because I want to look at the present. And I want to look, as a person who studies borders, at the way we think about drawing and demarcating borders in a world where, until recently or even today, we tend to be very passé about the issue of drawing borders, because we say most of the world's land borders have been determined, they've been drawn, and there aren't major issues around the world's land boundaries. It's true of much of the world. It certainly wasn't true 100 years ago, and I think what was described here in terms of Sykes-Picot in the Middle East, and that was just one region which underwent a tremendous amount of border drawing in the 20th century. The same was true of the colonial superimposition of boundaries in Africa. The same was true of the distribution and redrawing of borders in Central and Eastern Europe after the First World War, and through the Soviet Union period, and again after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So borders are a very dominant feature in the history of the 20th century, as we come to determine what at least the European concept of a nation state is, the Westphalian concept of states, where groups or national groups are sovereign in a very determined and a very fixed territory. And that territory is determined by what we call the borders or the boundaries. In other words, the world order is a set of compartments, territorial compartments, and each compartment has a clearly defined border and boundary. And as we move into the latter part of the century and into the present century, the basic idea is to say, well, you know, we're pretty much finished with drawing boundaries around the world. There aren't many places where we still have to draw boundaries. There are big issues concerning the management of boundaries, how do boundaries function, what are their significance, but we've really drawn them and there aren't major territorial disputes over that. And I'm going to focus on one of those few areas where there still very much is that dispute, and that is, of course, my own backyard, Israel-Palestine. I work at Gurion University. I live in a community called Meitar, which is literally 2 kilometers south of the southernmost point of the West Bank, which you see on this caricature here, this map caricature. And actually the jurisdiction area of the municipality within which I live, actually its northernmost boundary is the southernmost boundary of the West Bank. And as I've explained in another class this morning, when I drive from Meitar to Jerusalem, I often just turn right. I don't go round the long way. I often turn right, cross into the West Bank, and 55 minutes later cross out of the West Bank back into Jerusalem, which means that twice in the space of 50 minutes, I cross what is, to all effect, a boundary today. There are barriers, cars are stopped, your documents are checked, you're asked who you are allowed to cross, you're not allowed to cross. It's much easier for me as an Israeli to cross than it is for a Palestinian to cross from the West Bank into Israel. If you don't have a work permit, you can't do that. So although it was set up as a security barrier over the past 15 years, it is to all effect a functional boundary which works and functions as a boundary. But I must just make an aside to this and say, as we saw from the past lecture, of course, is to say that at least in one region of the world, the wider Middle East, boundaries are coming apart. And they may or may not be the same in 5 or 6 years' time. We really don't know, because we really don't know how this whole business of ISIS and the Islamic State is going to work its way through. But clearly ISIS today control an area which is very different to the territorial distribution which came after Sykes-Picot and the establishment of Syria and Iraq, as we saw so well in the maps a few minutes ago. And there may be the redrawing of boundaries, and one of the reasons is, which is why it's happening, is because Sykes-Picot and what came after Sykes-Picot was a very typical case of where European powers did come in, just as they did in Africa, just as they did much long before that in Latin America as well, in other parts of the world, and basically they determined, based on their own political interests, where and how the boundaries should be drawn in these far-off regions. In some cases, they related to the distributions of the local populations. In many other cases, they didn't, and therefore you had the classic example that we're looking at today, Syria and Iraq, but particularly Iraq, which of course is really composed of the 3 vilayets, which we saw in the map, of the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, who, as an outsider looking in until about 15 years ago, if you weren't a scholar of the region and you really didn't know what was going on in the region, you always had this sort of conception, well, Iraq is a country, it's mostly Arabs, there's Saddam Hussein, you know, it somehow functions. And it's only recently where just the neutral observer has become much more understanding of the tremendous internal diversity within the Islamic world, between the Islamic world and the Kurdish world, and how this relates to the drawing of maps, drawing of boundaries in the past century. And of course, the Kurdish issue, which, as you saw from the maps, is spread over Iraq, Iran, Turkey, partly Syria. Probably today, someone could correct me if this is an incorrect statement, they are probably the single largest ethnic national group, over 20 million people, which don't have a state of their own. But they've been, in a sense, kept down to a certain extent by Iraq, by Iran, by Turkey, over their own periods of time. So there have been occasions when Iraq and Iran have been in conflict with each other, or where Turkey has sought to alleviate certain issues, where the boundaries have been open for short periods of time, allowing the Kurds from one region to communicate and move across the borders into the Kurdish areas. But on the whole, the states which were created during the past 100 years, they created, in other words, the Kurds became minority populations, minority ethnic populations in 3-4 states, rather than having a clearly defined territorial entity of their own. And there's probably no better example on the world's political map than the case of the Kurds as to what the impact of the external superimposition of boundaries is on the ethnic territories of different groups. So we do see today that the Middle East is, as someone said this morning, is in ferment. I like that. It's a nice sort of British understatement, which understates the extent to which, of course, the region is undergoing political and territorial change. And the truth is we don't know. It could well be that at the end of the day, we will end up with the same boundaries that we've had for the past 100 years, and things will return to that situation. It could be that new boundaries will be carved out in part of that region. But of course, part of that region, as we saw, is also Israel-Palestine. And Israel-Palestine, one second please. Thank you. And Israel-Palestine, as we know, is a pretty small piece of real estate, no bigger than 25,000 square kilometers. That's Israel and all of the occupied territories together. Israel, the Gaza Strip, West Bank and the Golan Heights, which I think is about the third of the size of the state of Florida. And yet it makes a hell of a lot of noise, doesn't it? It's always on the front lines. You know, if you didn't know how small it was, you'd think this was the big mega state of the world. Because the conflict in Israel-Palestine is ongoing, never seems to be resolved. We certainly don't seem to be particularly close to resolving the problem today. I would say we were probably closer 10, 15 years ago than we are today. And much of it focuses around the issue of the respective state territories of Israel and potentially a future Palestinian state. That's not the only issue. Borders are not the only issue. Of course it isn't. But as a person who works in the area of borders, I want over the next 15, 20 minutes to talk you through the discourses of drawing borders between Israel and the Palestinian state. And so what you see on this caricature is you see, in a sense, something relatively simple. You see what has been the territorial question. Next week is Israel's 67th Independence Day. But for more than 67 years, for about 80 years now, and even a bit more, the big issue has been, how do you take a small piece of real estate, a small piece of territory, and divide it up between two competing claims? And when you think of the way that history has developed over the past 70 years, it has, of course, become much more complex. This makes the issue of border drawing look very simple. But in reality, the issue of border drawing is much more complex. And there you see two gentlemen, neither of whom are alive anymore, 20 years ago, at the time of the Oslo Accords, trying to draw up a boundary between Israel and a Palestinian state, and of course getting rather confused in what is, of course, a much more complex issue, because one line represents security, and one line represents water, and one line represents settlements, and one line represents transportation, and one line represents historical claims, and another line represents identity, and so on and so on. And think, if it was that complicated 20 years ago, or 20 years ago, think how much even more complex it is today as every day passes and more roads are built and more settlements are constructed and more developments take place. So everything changes the geographic reality on the ground, makes it even more complex than it was yesterday, so that if and when the two sides do get back to some sort of bilateral negotiations, they have to deal with an extremely complex reality. Believe you me, as someone who's been involved in Track 2 discussions and looking at maps and looking at boundaries, had we been able at the time of Oslo to simply take this territory and draw a nice clean line which said all the Israelis and the Jews on this side, all the Arabs and the Palestinians on that side, then that line would have been drawn. But there is, of course, no such line. And any demarcation, any bilateral agreement, at the moment the line is partially superimposed by one side on the other, the security barrier. But even any bilateral agreement on drawing a line would mean that both sides have to make some very major territorial compromises, and I'll show you a few of them in a moment, so that the only way that you can